one needs to make the point that the existence of extreme poverty, at least, really does violate rights. And that needs to be accepted and established. Once that's done, then obviously it's a question of coming up with programs and approaches which will resolve that. 20 years ago, there were relatively few strong ideas out there, relatively little experience in the human rights world. Today, that's not the case. There are many techniques that are well known for tackling poverty from a human rights perspective. Events-based monitoring is much more appealing and easier to do because you have a specific event, you can interview witnesses, you can perhaps film, you can document, and you can make a precise claim. If 100 people were killed, if 20 people have been tortured or whatever. That doesn't apply in relation to many economic and social rights. It applies to some. Right to education might involve the exclusion of children from a particular minority group. You can count them. It's an incident, they're turned away from school. But for the most part, economic and social rights are violated as a result of systemic policies. I would say often deliberate neglect on the part of governments, just a decision that looking after poor people in some way is not a priority that they care about. Policy monitoring is very important in relation to economic and social rights, but we shouldn't confine it to those rights. It's also important in relation to civil and political rights. Again, if you're worried about killings, you can focus on a particular incident where X number of people were shot to death. But if you don't address the deeper policy dimensions, what enabled that to happen? Why are the police not instructed? Why are they not better monitored? Economic and social rights are not different. Why is it that large numbers of people are left in hunger, left without any basic medical care? Policy monitoring is what enables you to establish that these people are not on the policy radar screen. There isn't a policy for them. In many ways, economic and social rights policy can be boiled down to fiscal policy, tax policy, finance policy. Governments choose where they're going to spend their money. Most governments end up choosing to spend their money, to the extent we're talking about the social sector, on the wealthy or on the middle classes. They choose to exclude the poor or to implement policies that are not at all progressive. If they were to change those policies, then the situation of the poor would be radically changed.
So quantitative methods can really reveal new and different things about human rights violations and about human rights fulfillment than only using qualitative data. So for example, it can show you what's going on at the level of the population. It can show you trends over time. And then you can disaggregate it to show you really interesting information about inequalities, about changes in different geographic locations, and also you can see whether there have been backsliding, which is going to be relevant to issues such as non-retrogression. So national human rights institutions are in a great position to access secondary data. Some of the things that they could immediately get are they could work with their national statistics offices to obtain administrative data, service data, so that would be things like water use, access to sanitation, things like access to education, enrollment rates. And then also they can access survey data. So that would be surveys, for example, the demographic and health surveys that are USAID funded surveys. The MIX, which is UNICEF funded survey that's also done in many countries. And then the World Bank has a series of household surveys as well. Those data are extremely helpful and actually have a lot of the attributes of the types of data you would want to use for human rights monitoring. Finally, census data has a lot to tell you about human rights and can be immediately accessed. So primary data might be important for a human rights institution to gather in spaces and issues where there is no secondary data available, or perhaps where there hasn't been a recent update of that secondary data, there might be a need to collect primary data. So some things that immediately come to mind are, for example, there are issues that are harder to collect data about if you're the state. So if you're a state institution, for example, certain kinds of corruption issues, perhaps, or issues around populations that are criminalized, it's very hard for the state to get data that's accurate about those populations or those issues because people may want to hide, for example, their behavior or their status. And so a national human rights institution has an independence that would allow it perhaps to set up a survey or another kind of data gathering instrument that would protect the rights holder while also allowing data to be gathered about them. So data visualization is extremely important when presenting data. There's been recent research that shows that using a visualization, even a basic one like a graph, is much more effective in persuading and in presenting a message than presenting data in a table, for example. So being able to visualize data is really important in getting the message across and showing really why numbers are revealing something about a human rights issue. So some of the characteristics of effective data visualization are, first of all, I would say accuracy and precision and just being truthful to the data. And that includes both showing what we know, but also showing uncertainties. So that's one of them. But the main thing is really telling a story. So taking the data, analyzing it appropriately, and then telling a story with the visualization so that the viewer really gets why this data is showing a human rights issue, maybe a human rights violation or a problem with fulfillment or an inequality issue. And you really can, using visualization, show that immediately. And you can show more information often in a visualization than you can in text. It will take you maybe a couple of paragraphs, for example, to convey a really important point that you could show in one visualization. So it's a very effective storytelling technique if used right.
Well, there are at least 4 different and distinct stages in any government's budget cycle which provide opportunities for human rights institutions and citizens to be able to engage with governments on their budgets. Government budget formulation is the start of the budget making process. This is typically something that is led and coordinated by the finance ministry or the treasury of the country along with line ministries. They then present the budget to national legislatures for approval. So that's the second opportunity to engage on budget formulation. After national legislatures approve of the budget, budgets are implemented by line ministries, again in coordination with the finance ministry. That's an important point to ensure that what is approved into the budgets is actually spent, which is not a fair assumption to make, unfortunately, in a large number of countries. And finally, is the evaluation of the budgets at the end of the year. There are a number of tools that human rights institutions and others can use to analyze government budget allocations. So the first key point to remember is that there's no one way to do it, and it is something that can be done by a variety of organizations depending on their perspectives. There's at least 2 key characteristics to being effective on budget analysis work. The first is, and this is from our experience of working with civil society organizations around the world and seeing what constitutes successful civil society experiences in analyzing government budgets. The first is having strong evidence-based advocacy. So getting the facts correct, relying on information in government budgets and undertaking an analysis of those budgets in a rigorous way. So there are no shortcuts out there. One has to be very thorough in the research that is done. The second thing, which is perhaps even more important, is that it's not just a number crunching exercise. It's about presenting that analysis in a compelling way that makes the case that governments need to change the way in which they are developing their budgets or administering their budgets so that they result in the kinds of outcomes that we are interested in, better human rights outcomes.
Data, right, as we define data, are discrete pieces of information, and they're often things, when we say data, what we're talking about is pieces of information that can be put into different categories and that we can organize easily. That's data. But for human rights, people working on human rights work, anybody that's working on any sort of social justice or social change advocacy, what's important about data is when it becomes evidence, right? So what you are wanting your evidence to, or your data to do, is to prove facts. So factors that you should be very much keeping in mind when you're drawing conclusions is you need your conclusions to be as simple as possible. You want your evidence to be very straightforward. You want people to be able to see it and make conclusions themselves. So I think staff working within national human rights institutes and organizations, or anyone that is working in a human rights framework that is wanting to utilize data, they really need to be thinking about the users of the data. How are people going to be picking it up, doing things with it, and what are going to be the aims of that? So how is that going to further an advocacy campaign? How is that going to make a policy change, or whatever change they're trying to do? So very much that issue of thinking about the user and how is the user going to pick up the data and then use it. So one of the things that I've been hearing a lot recently is let's end the 90-page or the 900-page report that's full of statistics. That in a way is a bit of a misnomer. In some ways, you do want those reports, you do need all that data, but it's when you want to communicate that data to audiences that are not going to sit through or sift through a 90-page report, that's where the visualizations become very, very important. Really important that you have that goal, that you understand this is the change that we want, and you can then evaluate and learn about your data and how well it's getting you there.
So we look at monitoring as a tool to enlighten the Commission towards conducting its work and seeing whether all those involved stakeholders and duty bearers are meeting their obligations in accordance to international principles of human rights and our own basic law, which sets forth the rights that should be enjoyed by our own citizens. I think it allows more for constructive dialogue with official institutions when you speak about economic, social, cultural rights, because we know that these rights are progressive. They need human resources and financial resources. They very heavily depend on cooperation and international aid and support. And it is a developmental process. You can't look at it like, of course, taking that into consideration, this is a legal obligation. Lately, the Commission has communicated with the Bureau of Statistics, the Palestinian Bureau of Statistics, in order to ensure how could we benefit from this bulk of information. They also can conduct specific surveys through a memorandum of understanding that we will be initiating together with them. We can really provide information through general surveys that are being done on issues that we want them to focus on. We could easily, for example, add in one of the surveys that they will be conducting in the future on the right to work, for example. We can also ask specific questions that we think could provide us with more information on more marginalized groups, or also information on how people look at this in connection with their enjoyment of human rights. We can have 3, 4, 5 questions included in the general surveys of the Bureau of Statistics in order to benefit, because maybe we don't have the whole resources. So the idea was that if we cooperate with them, we can really benefit a lot from the information that we can get from them. Also, there was the idea that in the Memorandum of Understanding, we can also look at one of the treaties, or more than one of the treaties, that we will be reporting to. And then we can, through the Bureau of Statistics, get the information that they have and see how, if we wanted to report on each of the issues, what kind of information is still lacking. And we wanted to take one of the model treaties, for example, civil political rights, and also for economic, social, cultural rights, and see where are the information that we need still to gather, and ask from our knowledge, from knowing the treaties, we give guidance to the Bureau of Statistics, and from their knowledge of statistics and how to gather surveys and information, they could fill in the gaps based on that information.
Well, the Commission's report on the Christchurch earthquake recovery was really highlighted to us that we didn't firstly understand what the human rights issues arising in a natural disaster were, and secondly, once we understood what they were, and that they were mainly economic, social and cultural rights, we didn't really know how to measure them. So the process of actually getting the report together and the research was very new for us, I think, and it involved working with the Centre for Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and began with getting civil society and local Canterbury-based government people together to talk about, you know, the opera framework, how it would work, how the report would be, and the important to understand that the process of actually saying we were going to monitor economic and social rights, and then the way we began to do it was very different, I think, was new ground for the Commission and for the people. What we found, and we've only touched the surface of it, is that you can really find out what's going on if you actually do really good budget analysis, and you know, if you're good at it, you'll be able to find the lie, if you like, in what the political speak might be versus the actual investment reality.
We conducted rapid assessments on specific human rights because we felt there was a need to look into these rights. We identify them with regard to the amount of complaints that we receive. And these assessments have helped to identify the gaps, the issues that we have to address, and the gaps that the state has to address, because most of economic, social and cultural rights are systemic, and there are so many loopholes and gaps that have to be addressed, and we can identify and put forward recommendations with regard to our findings. In collecting information for these assessments, we used several tools like focus group discussions, and we used interviews and direct and informal interviews as well, and also checklists so that they can just tick and let us know what was required. And also we visited the places, and upon observation we found several issues that needed to be addressed, and we had stakeholder discussions as well.
When we used graphic, it's more important, most helpful for us how to read the situation. For example, if we just describe as information in our report, some people boring to read it. So maybe graphic will, when people saw our report related to the graphic, and they feel that it's more helpful and also more useful for them when they read our report.
We recently got a report saying that there are about 73 children had died in a hospital, infant, just born children. So we collected the details, how these hospital is working. Then we came to know that there are no doctors, there is no nursing assistants much. Then we give various directions and how the improvement could be made in respect of the hospital. Then series of such things, schools, education, how the education system is working. In Bihar, we got a report that the education system is not, there are large number of vacancies, and we came to know about 20,000 teachers are not there in the schools. This is how our monitoring system then we recommend, we bring this fact to the notice of the authorities.
Well, we have a questionnaire on the around 20 basic rights, beginning from right to life and right to education, to health and to shelter, to water, to job opportunity, to clean environment. And then our colleague goes and do the interviews with different people and different level of the society. Either they work with the government, or they are IDPs, for example, or they are returnees, as we had a lot of refugees and they came back to the country, to see what is their situation and what should be done in order to improve the situation for them. So, and then we collect all the data and then we analyze the report, and we do it again, as I said, that every second year, in order to see that is there an improvement, is there a gap in which sector. So then we can come up with a recommendation. For example, I mean, a few years ago, our government was saying on the access to basic health services that 82% of the people has access to basic health services. And our survey showed that only 54% of the people had access. And then we saw that the government next year came up with a 58%. So there's a big difference. So we put the government in a position to look at the situation, not only give a really a very good percentage or data to the people, but look at the reality, what is the people's access to those issues.
Because of their systemic nature, economic and social rights are actually more difficult or present different difficulties to monitor, unlike civil and political rights, where it's easier to identify which right has been violated and who are the victims and who are the perpetrators of this violation of this human rights. Economic and social rights would require NHRIs to actually investigate or conduct more investigation, in-depth investigation into the problems, identify the issues, identify the causes of the failure or the violation of these rights, and who are the parties involved, and what measures actually have not been taken and should be taken to address this gaps or these violations. This project on access to education for children with learning disabilities, we wanted to do it with the objective of raising awareness amongst the professionals, the policymakers, teachers, and the public as well, in relation to the challenges faced by children with learning disabilities on accessing education at the primary school level. And we also hope that through this project, we'll be able to identify the gaps in the information on education for children with learning disabilities, so that we can build upon this gaps, support for such education. And finally, we wanted to build the bridge between the government agencies as well as the civil society, which also provide such programs, so as to promote a more participatory, transparent and accountable policy making in the education sector.
Human rights monitoring is a complicated job. Unless and until we develop our basic indicators, we cannot do anything with regard to the human rights monitoring findings. Therefore, we have made a decision that we have to develop our indicators so that we can monitor the human rights situation on the basis of these indicators. And we have, while we were developing the indicators, we made so many consultation meetings with the stakeholders first, And then after we have drafted content, and we have a series of meetings with the stakeholders from the civil society organizations, stakeholders from the government organizations, and even from the international community like OSCHR, which was working in Nepal at that time. Some instances in Nepal that National Human Rights Commission has monitored in the supply of textbooks, in supply of medicine, in supply of date expired medicines as well. And NHRC has drew attention of the Nepal government, and then and there within 1 week, textbooks have been reached in the remote areas. Medicine has been reached in the remote areas. Sometimes in food scarcity, starvation of food, food has been reached in the remote areas after the monitoring of National Human Rights Commission.
At the moment, the economic and social rights cover a vast area, including business and human rights, and we have had complaints on the role of business impacting on environment and impacting on the people. And we also have problems with migrant workers, complaints on migrant workers, as well as complaints on community rights, the impact of government policy on people, especially in community rights.